the time the first Afghan troops arrived, U.S. Special Forces had already secured the base, as the fighting continued just to the north, slowly moving toward Herat.
Soon after the arrival of coalition troops, heavy fighting stopped and a ceasefire was arranged, but not before the political landscape in western Afghanistan had dramatically changed. The initial Quick Reaction Force was quickly reinforced by nearly 1,000 Afghan National Police, a second-tier security force primarily being trained by the German government. Once the fighting stopped, the lead renegade commander, Amanullah Khan, was spirited out of the city to Kabul, put under a loose form of house arrest, even while his men held dozens of Khan's foot soldiers prisoner. In the end, Ismail Khan was offered a job in Karzai's government, but he refused, deciding instead to become a private citizen for the time being. This is advanced infantry training, Afghan style. At this stage in the life of this army, small unit tactics are about all the Afghans have managed to grasp. In such an inhospitable area, the enemy is rarely seen.
And then there were two guys on the hilltop back here when we stopped our first time. So one of the men started walking off, running down the ridge this way. So when we stopped the second time, the second guy that we saw moving was out of sight. The first guy was still there, so we came up this side to see what they were up to.
Didn't find him?
Well, the shepherd boy said he was one of them. He said there wasn't another man up there. But the commandant and I both saw two men up there.
The job of teaching those tactics fall to American ETTs, otherwise known as embedded training teams.
Go ahead
and get them online.
PCI كان مكمل باشه ما نفهمیدیم چی هستن.
PCI چی معنی؟ تجهیزات مکمل.
Make sure everybody's got everything.
This Kandak, based in Kalat, provides most of the security for the city and the surrounding areas in Zabul province.
توجه سربازای شامل وظیفه طول ماش پیشروی کندک سربازای شامل وظیفه طول پیشروی کندک ماش
Based in a 19th century British fort, their living quarters are surrounded by tons of old munitions from wars gone by. Their job to patrol the areas surrounding the provincial capital, keeping an eye out for any sign of trouble that could disrupt the election. From this base, U.S. ETTs attached to the 45th Infantry Division help these new soldiers hone their skills. A dozen advisors in all help guide more than 500 Afghans in the art of small unit warfare. These men, part of the third rotation of U.S. advisors, are close to going home. But being short on time doesn't mean it's time to slack off.
Even here in a very troubled Zabul province, the Green Berets of the ANA get signs of approval as they patrol the countryside.
With the election just a few months away, the troops keep the pressure up. These soldiers, considered veterans of the ANA, didn't start out so organized. It's taken them more than a year of non-stop training in real combat conditions to get to this point. Experience would prove to be a decisive factor for the ANA in September of 2004, little more than a month after strongman Ismail Khan was removed from power. Riots erupted in Herat as hundreds set fire to shops, aid agencies, and UN buildings. Alongside American ETTs, the ANA was able to control and limit the riots, which subsided after a few tense days. Taking no chances, the Americans sent reinforcements to Herat and effectively helped the Afghans stabilize the vital city. Life as an embedded trainer is much different than life for most other soldiers serving in Afghanistan.
Embedded trainers, you're not a complete unit, so you're supporting yourself. And it's trying to understand how to get items in town, soap, fuel, food, is a lot more difficult than it is just going to Walmart.
Or being in the Army.
Yes, or being in the Army where there's a unit that you know where they're located and you can go and get those items of supply.
Since Task Force Phoenix formed, the U.S. Army's National Guard has been tasked with training the new Afghan National Army.
It's the training I've learned is kind of a train the trainer. Now I'm trying to work with these officers in the Afghan National Army that they can solve their own problems, that they don't have to rely upon us to develop their mission plans. And I think they're doing a really good job of that. They can look at a mission they're given and design a plan that will help them succeed in the mission. I think the thing that we need to come further in than we are is the logistics side of it for the Afghan National Army. And I think we're starting to get that turn going, but it's going to be a while.
Working in groups of 12 to 15, the ETTs lived in separate quarters than the men they trained, but were nearby 24 hours a day. As a new recruit to the Afghan National Army, your hitch would start here at the Kabul Military Training Center, also known as KMTC, the Afghan version of boot camp. For the past 30 years, Afghan warlords have helped keep the winds of war blowing in one direction or the other. One of the most difficult tasks for the coalition is the disarming of those militias. The coalition hopes the key is to provide the men with job skills or a spot in the new Afghan National Army. The government tried many incentives to whittle away at the militias. Some worked, some didn't. These men are the last to get an opportunity to retain their officer rank as they move from militia life to Army life. They'll go through their own boot camp together, but once trained, they'll eventually be split up and assigned to various Kandaks around the country. Regular Army recruits are taken from all corners of Afghanistan. By the summer of 2004, recruiting stations had been set up in at least 15 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces.
Some of them seem to be enjoying it a lot because they're doing it for their country and they understand why they're doing it for their country. So after we leave, they'll be able to sustain the training and carry on without any supervision, and it seems to be going real well. They're in their 8th week and they're getting a little bit more training, more hands-on than what a regular U.S. Army basic training would get. They're going straight from basic straight to a mortar, so it'd be straight to a job description, which we'd go through the whole 8 weeks of basic and then go to a job. They're getting it crunched down real short, so they're getting right into it real fast.
Some of the soldiers are just going through the motions. put that rod through the barrel, they should see that rod come out the chamber. One of the problems, the reason that was happening was because the rod was too short, so maybe there's some way we can get along.
The biggest thing is the language barrier, and then going through the translator and getting our point across, and then them being able to translate it exactly the way we want it. To me, we're more standoffish, and the ANA is actually running the show, and we're trying to ease our presence into the rear, so whenever they do have a question, we can help lead them in the right direction, so they'll be able to answer it for themselves.
This Army is the exit strategy for the Americans. Once it's up and running and able to defend the elected government, the Americans hope to pull the bulk of their troops out as NATO takes over the lead role in 2006. By September 2004, around 12,000 ANA troops were trained and in the field, most of them involved in combat operations. This Kandak, like all graduating Kandaks, performed the Atan dance, a traditional Afghan dance that is now a tradition for graduating recruits as well. This Kandak is also the last Kandak to graduate before the presidential election, and unlike any other Kandak, they'll be put to a test that will have them making a difficult choice between family and country. Part of the challenge the coalition had with the Afghan National Army at this time involved money. There was a lack of infrastructure to get the men paid, and when they did get paid, many times unit strength would dwindle overnight, as scores of men went absent without leave. Depending on where the soldier was paid would depend on how long it took him to get to his family, settle business, and then return. Some never do return, taking the paycheck and the satisfaction, knowing that $70 a month isn't enough for a life in the new army. With the election just a month away, the Afghan Ministry of Interior was concerned about paying 25 Kandak, the final Kandak to graduate before the election. The fear was that the men would follow current practice and leave just before a very critical time in the country's history. The Afghan officers in charge were quietly nervous of the men's reaction when told their pay would be held until after the elections. Not only that, but they were shipping out immediately to the spiritual heart of the Taliban. 25 Kandak was going to Kandahar. 25 Kandak would have another striking distinction. They would be the first Afghan unit led by non-American embedded training teams. This Romanian embedded training team is the first from that country and one of the few non-American conventional units to deploy downrange. By the summer of 2004, ISAF had bolstered its force to nearly 9,000 men, the largest contingent being offered by Canada, with more than 1,900 soldiers in Afghanistan. Here, Canadian forces based out of Camp Julian patrolled their sector of the capital Kabul, which is split into sectors of responsibility. Most of the ISAF troops are stationed in or near the capital, providing stability for the capital and the fledgling government. In 2004, just one serious car bomb shook the capital, but for the most part, the city was a bustling center of activity, and its 3 million inhabitants worked to eke out a life in one of the poorest countries in the world. For the first time in 2 decades, the people here were enjoying consecutive years of peace, and it showed all over the capital. But things in the west and south were not as peaceful. While the French maintained 200 commandos near the border town of Spin Boldak, the Romanians provided forced security for the growing base at Kandahar Airfield. It's a place in the global war on terror Romania wants to be. Their relationship with the Americans here has been good. Big points for Romania as they try to join NATO and entice the United States to build bases in their country, which were approved by the Romanian government in 2005. The unit rotates every 6 months and was first deployed to Kandahar in 2002. By 2004, the Romanians' mission had grown, and they were now set to deploy to the city of Kandahar itself to help guide a Kandak of nearly 800 Afghan soldiers. New recruits, the Romanians, have been training now for several weeks. But first, there's a fear that the men will mutiny when their commanding officer tells them they won't be paid and that they're in Kandahar. While the decision not to pay the men was made by the Afghans, the Americans were expected to break the news, something the Americans don't want to do. While the two sides decide what to do, armed soldiers begin to drift into the formation to help keep the peace in the event things go wrong. In the end, with the Americans by their side, the Afghans take responsibility for the situation. Amidst grumbles, the men would calmly return to their barracks and ponder their next move. Surprisingly, by morning, only a handful from 25 Kandak deserted, and within 2 days the rest would be on their way to Kandahar. Their task will take them as a national Afghan army in force to the heart of the Taliban. The strategy, the government's display of strength, will reassure people into voting. The total number of Americans killed in Afghanistan was just cresting 100 in the summer of 2004. Afghan troops on the front lines were taking much heavier casualties.